He promised her forever, but 2 days after their wedding, forever turned into a death sentence. She never saw it coming. Sandra Harris, a strong and accomplished woman, had spent 60 years building a life most could only dream of. After dedicating her life to her career, she thought she had finally found something that had eluded her for so long: love. It was sudden and surprising. A charming young man entered her life, full of promises and dreams of a new chapter. His charm was undeniable, and Sandra, for the first time in a long while, felt alive and hopeful. But just 2 days after they exchanged vows, her world crumbled. The man who had vowed to stand by her forever was hiding a dark secret, one that would turn her newfound joy into tragedy. And here's the shocking part. This wasn't the first time he had done something like this. What if the person you trusted the most, the one who held your hand and promised to protect you, was plotting against you all along? Worse still, what if they had done it before and were already planning to do it again? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you for tuning in and supporting us, especially to our loyal subscribers. We're here to bring you compelling stories of real-life crime, some you've heard before and others you haven't. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stay updated on new episodes. Now, let's dive into Sandra Louise Harris's story, a tale of success, betrayal, and heartbreak. Sandra Harris was a force of nature in the business world. Over decades, she built her company from the ground up with grit, late nights, and smart decisions. Her dedication was unmatched. Every challenge she faced only pushed her to work harder. And it paid off. She created an empire that stood as a testament to her relentless ambition. But as her business thrived, her personal life suffered. Long hours, constant pressure, and emotional distance wore down her marriage. Eventually, it fell apart. After the divorce, Sandra was left feeling hollow. No amount of professional success could fill the loneliness that had slowly crept into her life. When she retired, Sandra thought she would finally enjoy the fruits of her labor. She had financial security, a beautiful home, and all the comforts one could ask for. But she felt lost. Without the constant demands of her business, her days felt empty. The loneliness she had ignored for so long became impossible to escape. She longed for connection, for someone to share her life with. That's when he came along, this young, charismatic man who seemed to offer everything she'd been missing. Sandra thought she had finally found her second chance at happiness. Little did she know, it would lead to heartbreak unlike anything she had ever experienced. She realized that, apart from the occasional visit from her kids and a few close friends, she didn't really have anyone to share her everyday life with. Holidays were often quiet, spent alone in her big, empty house. The busy, lively days she used to know were long gone, leaving behind a silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. Even though she rarely admitted it, Sandra secretly wished for companionship. Someone who could bring some warmth back into her life and share the little joys of being together. But even with this longing, Sandra was careful. She had been hurt before, and life had taught her to be cautious, especially when it came to men. Younger men, in particular, weren't even a consideration for her. She saw herself as an older woman, past the stage where falling in love or starting something new felt natural. The thought of dating someone younger felt almost embarrassing to her, like something out of a movie or a book, not real life. From time to time, younger men had shown her interest, but she always dismissed it. She figured they were either mistaken or had intentions that didn't align with what she wanted. Sandra valued her self-respect and dignity too much to entertain the idea, and she never let herself dream about starting a romance with someone significantly younger. Sandra had always believed she wasn't the type for whirlwind romances or grand gestures of love, especially with someone younger. She saw herself as grounded, practical, and too seasoned for such indulgences. Love, if it were to happen, would come quietly, without drama or complications. But life has a way of throwing surprises when we least expect them. That surprise came in the form of Jamal Preston. At 29, Jamal was the kind of man who drew attention effortlessly. He had the charm of someone who always knew what to say, the confidence of someone who never doubted his place in a room, and a style that suggested he cared deeply about appearances. To anyone on the outside, Jamal seemed like the ideal suitor, attentive, polished, and full of life. But beneath that polished surface was a man with secrets dark enough to shatter any illusion. Jamal hadn't had an easy start in life. Growing up in chaos and uncertainty, he had learned one harsh truth early on: survival meant taking what you needed, no matter the cost. Over time, he refined this lesson into an art form, crafting a life based on manipulation and deceit. For the past 3 years, he had been targeting wealthy older women who appeared lonely or disconnected from their surroundings. He would study them, figure out their vulnerabilities, and become the perfect man for each one, a chameleon whose charm hid his true intentions. Sandra was just his latest target, though she had no way of knowing it. She couldn't have guessed that Jamal had already left behind a trail of destruction. His history was a string of fake identities, hurried marriages, and tragedies that seemed like unfortunate accidents to the outside world. In reality, Jamal orchestrated every outcome, walking away richer each time. To others, he appeared to be the doting younger husband, but behind closed doors, he was cold and calculating, with no room for genuine affection. His love wasn't for the women he pursued, but for the security their bank accounts provided. It was a breezy summer evening when their paths crossed at a community fundraiser, one of those events Sandra attended more out of habit than enjoyment. She wasn't there to meet anyone. She was simply going through the motions of staying socially connected. As she sipped her glass of wine and scanned the room, she felt the familiar detachment creeping in. These events always felt the same: polite conversations, distant acquaintances, and an undercurrent of loneliness she tried to ignore. Jamal noticed her long before she saw him. He studied her from across the room, noting the quiet grace with which she moved, the soft smile she offered to those who approached her. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. There was a sadness in them, a hint of longing she didn't seem to realize she was showing. She laughed at jokes and nodded at conversations, but there was something distant about her, as if part of her mind was elsewhere. To Jamal, she was perfect. Before we dive back into the rest of this story, if you're finding this journey insightful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and share it with someone who could use this reminder. It helps support the channel, and it means we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. Now, let's get back to it. Jamal's sharp instincts told him right away that Sandra would be an ideal person to connect with. When he walked over to her, he kept things light and casual. His relaxed attitude and warm smile made Sandra feel comfortable almost instantly. He spoke in a friendly tone, with just the right amount of respect, and kept his body language calm and approachable. He knew better than to come on too strong, so instead, he focused on easygoing conversation, throwing in a few jokes here and there to keep things fun and light-hearted. To her surprise, Sandra found herself enjoying the chat more than she thought she would. Jamal was easy to talk to, and there was something about him that felt genuine, something she hadn't felt in years. Still, she kept her guard up. A part of her appreciated the attention, but she dismissed it as him just being nice. Jamal, however, was playing a long game. He wasn't new to this, and he knew how to take his time. Over the next few weeks, he made a point of attending community events where he knew Sandra would be. Each meeting felt like a coincidence to her, but in reality, Jamal had carefully orchestrated these moments. With each encounter, he picked up little bits of information about her. He noticed her interests, listened to her stories, and paid attention to the small details that most people overlooked, like the way her face lit up when she talked about her favorite book, or how she paused before answering personal questions. Jamal watched closely, learning what made her laugh, what made her hesitant, and what helped her relax. Instead of overwhelming her with attention, Jamal played it cool. He found ways to compliment her in a way that felt genuine, not forced, breaking down her skepticism bit by bit. His approach was subtle, small gestures like remembering something she mentioned in passing or finding ways to show he was paying attention. These thoughtful actions made it hard for Sandra to ignore his presence. Over time, she began to lower her walls, drawn in by his persistence and the warmth he exuded. Jamal wasn't rushing. He was leaving breadcrumbs, letting her follow them at her own pace, while keeping himself in her thoughts with his quiet, consistent gestures. Slowly but surely, Sandra began to let her guard down. Jamal would call her late at night, and they would talk for hours. Their conversations weren't shallow or routine. They were deep and meaningful, stretching into the early morning. Jamal asked about her life, what she dreamed of, what she regretted, and what mattered most to her. Sandra found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years. She talked about her youth, her ambitions, the tough choices she had made to grow her business, and the loneliness that often crept in as a result. With every story Sandra shared, Jamal listened intently. He didn't just nod along or give quick responses. He made her feel seen and heard, as though every detail she revealed mattered deeply to him. It felt like Jamal was gently peeling back the layers of protection Sandra had built around her heart, raking down the walls she thought no one could touch. But Jamal's efforts didn't stop at words. He had a knack for showing he cared in small, thoughtful ways. He learned what she liked, her favorite tea, the books she loved, the little things that made her smile. On ordinary days, he would surprise her with a card or flowers, gestures that felt warm and personal. Jamal even went out of his way to find books he knew would resonate with her. After she read them, they'd talk about the characters and themes, and Jamal would listen carefully to her thoughts. These moments made her feel valued, not just for her emotions but for her intellect too. Bit by bit, Sandra started to feel like she wasn't just sharing her life, but living it with someone who truly cared. Sandra started to feel like, just maybe, she'd finally found someone who really understood her, someone who saw beyond her age and the wealth she had. Little by little, as Jamal showed her kindness, her doubts began to slip away. She began to feel a kind of hope she hadn't experienced in years. Jamal's presence brought life to her quiet home, filling it with laughter and company. Her days, once lonely, were now filled with shared moments of happiness and warmth. For the first time in decades, Sandra found herself opening up, letting her guard down in a way that went against everything her instincts had taught her. She was falling for Jamal, the man who seemed to care for her in a way that made her feel seen, loved, and cherished. As time went on, the walls she'd carefully built around her heart started to crumble. But while Sandra was seeing the growth of something beautiful, Jamal saw things differently. For him, this wasn't about love, it was about opportunity. Sandra, in her trust and vulnerability, had opened the door to a life of financial security for him. To Jamal, this wasn't about sharing a future, it was about gaining access to everything Sandra had worked for. His every move was part of a careful plan to win her over, to make sure she was pulled deeper into his web of charm and promises. Sandra, despite feeling the risk, convinced herself it was worth it. She told herself that for the first time in a long while, she deserved to dream of a future with someone who made her feel special. What she didn't know was that behind Jamal's caring words and warm smile, there was a man with no intention of keeping the promises he'd made. He was only interested in one thing: the wealth she could offer. Sandra started to feel like just maybe she'd finally found someone who really understood her, someone who saw beyond her age and the wealth she had. Little by little, as Jamal showed her kindness, her doubts began to slip away. She began to feel a kind of hope she hadn't experienced in years. Jamal's presence brought life to her quiet home, filling it with laughter and company. Her days, once lonely, were now filled with shared moments of happiness and warmth. For the first time in decades, Sandra found herself opening up, letting her guard down in a way that went against everything her instincts had taught her. She was falling for Jamal, the man who seemed to care for her in a way that made her feel seen, loved, and cherished. As time went on, the walls she'd carefully built around her heart started to crumble. But while Sandra was seeing the growth of something beautiful, Jamal saw things differently. For him, this wasn't about love, it was about opportunity. Sandra, in her trust and vulnerability, had opened the door to a life of financial security for him. To Jamal, this wasn't about sharing a future, it was about gaining access to everything Sandra had worked for. His every move was part of a careful plan to win her over, to make sure she was pulled deeper into his web of charm and promises. Sandra, despite feeling the risk, convinced herself it was worth it. She told herself that for the first time in a long while, she deserved to dream of a future with someone who made her feel special. What she didn't know was that behind Jamal's caring words and warm smile, there was a man with no intention of keeping the promises he'd made. He was only interested in one thing: the wealth she could offer. Jamal would often talk about where he came from, sharing stories that made Sandra believe he had faced tough times but still managed to stay true to himself. He always spoke highly of her achievements, making her feel proud of everything she had accomplished. He really made it clear that he admired her life experiences and the wisdom she had gained over the years. To get even closer to Sandra, Jamal positioned himself as someone she could always lean on. He was the person who listened to her when she had worries and offered words of comfort. Over time, he became her go-to person, someone she could trust with her deepest thoughts. When Sandra would open up about her concerns like her health issues or the distance between her and her kids, Jamal was always there, reassuring her with kind words. He'd tell her how strong and resilient she was, making sure she felt valued and understood. He was careful not to overwhelm her, always finding the right balance between showing he cared and giving her space. It wasn't about pushing her into anything, but about making her feel like she could rely on him. By offering this kind of emotional support, Jamal slowly built a kind of dependence where Sandra began to trust him more and more. With that trust in place, Jamal started shifting his focus to her finances, subtly making it a bigger part of their conversations. Jamal knew he had to be careful. Sandra wasn't someone who could easily be fooled, especially when it came to money. She had worked hard for everything she had and knew how to take care of her finances. She wasn't the type to let anyone get close to her wealth without a reason. Jamal understood that, so he knew he had to be patient and strategic in his approach. At first, he started with small gestures. He would casually offer her advice on managing her finances, pretending that it was just to help her enjoy her retirement more easily. He'd mention things like how she deserved to relax and not worry, suggesting that it might be a good idea to combine her accounts for simplicity. It was all very subtle, nothing too forward, but enough to make her think. As time passed and their relationship deepened, Jamal began talking more about the future. He made sure to show that he was all in, that he saw a life with her. They talked about long-term goals, building a future together, and making decisions as a team. It was in these conversations that Jamal gently steered things towards more serious topics, like planning for the future, insurance, and even how to protect their assets. He carefully introduced the idea of her naming him as a beneficiary of her estate. It wasn't a direct ask. He presented it as something natural, almost like the next step in their growing relationship. After all, they were building a life together, weren't they? It seemed only practical. Sandra, feeling the connection and excited about their shared future, found herself agreeing with his suggestions. What seemed like thoughtful advice started to make sense to her. Sandra didn't have any close family members depending on her, so when Jamal started encouraging her to make changes to her estate, she felt like it made sense. Little by little, she added Jamal's name to her life insurance and financial plans, making sure he would inherit her wealth one day. Each decision seemed logical at the time, with Jamal always offering just the right words to reassure her and make her feel at ease with the changes. What Sandra didn't know, though, was that Jamal wasn't being honest. His intentions weren't about love or care. He was using her, just like he had used others before her. Sandra was far from the first person he had targeted, and unfortunately, she wouldn't be the last. Over the last few years, Jamal had gotten really good at his game. He knew exactly how to play it. First, he'd take time to learn about his target. Then, he'd step into their life slowly, charming them along the way, making sure they trusted him. As their relationship deepened, he'd start getting involved in their finances, always keeping his eye on the prize. Once his name was on the right papers, the whole thing would change, and he'd move on to his next victim. Sandra was actually the fifth woman Jamal had tricked in this way. The others were all disturbingly similar to her. Women who were financially comfortable, had no close family to protect them, and were easily charmed by Jamal's smooth talk. Some were divorced, some were widowed, but all ended up the same, alone and with nothing to show for it. After every marriage, something terrible seemed to happen to his wife. Each of his previous 4 wives had died in a tragic way. Heart attacks, sudden illnesses, and even unexpected falls took their lives. Jamal always played the grieving husband, heartbroken by the loss. But then he would quietly take what he was owed, collect his inheritance, and disappear without a trace. He'd move on to a new city, start a fresh life with a new name, and find a new woman to target. Sandra had no idea about this dark pattern that followed Jamal everywhere he went. He was good at covering his tracks, using fake names and made-up stories to keep each new partner in the dark. There was no sign of his past life. All Sandra saw was a charming man who swept her off her feet and made her feel loved. She didn't know the truth, that each of his relationships followed the same deadly script: a whirlwind romance, a quick marriage, and then, just weeks or months later, a tragic death, leaving Jamal as the only one to benefit. This time, Jamal's plan was more calculated than ever. He knew Sandra had heart problems and needed regular medication to manage her condition. He wasn't going to rely on an accident this time. He saw a chance to speed things up, using her own health against her. He started replacing her heart medication with harmless pills that wouldn't do anything at all. He was careful, making sure Sandra wouldn't notice the change. His plan was to gradually weaken her health until one day her passing would seem like just another sad but natural event. Jamal's eyes gleamed with anticipation as he carefully executed his scheme, knowing exactly when and how to strike. Sandra, trusting him and unaware of his intentions, continued to live her life, not realizing that the man she loved was the very one who would bring about her downfall. Jamal was counting down the days. Soon all the paperwork would be finished, and he'd have everything Sandra left behind. It was all going according to plan. He had played his cards right, and now it seemed like his luck had struck again. But what Jamal didn't know was that this time, things weren't going to go as smoothly as he thought. Sandra's sudden death had left people asking questions, ones that Jamal wasn't ready for. As he got ready to move on to the next chapter of his life, he'd soon realize that Sandra's story wasn't finished. And the choices he made? They would come back to haunt him in ways he never saw coming. Kira Harris had always been the one to look out for her mum, even if Sandra didn't always appreciate it. Kira, in her late 20s, had chosen to become a police officer because she had a strong sense of what was right and wrong. She wasn't the type to take things at face value. That healthy suspicion helped her in her work, and it carried over into her personal life too. She was sharp, always thinking ahead, and she couldn't ignore the responsibility she felt for her family. While Kira and Sandra had grown apart over the years, Kira still cared deeply for her mum. She knew her mother had always put others first, sacrificing a lot, especially when it came to her own family. Sandra had spent so much time focused on her work that the bond between them had faded. But Kira's love and sense of duty toward her mum never really went away. No matter how distant they'd become, she still had that protective instinct. And now, with Sandra gone, it seemed like the world was forcing Kira to step back into that role, even if she wasn't sure what she was walking into. Kira had always admired her mother, Sandra, for her strength and independence. Sandra had been through a lot, yet she always stood tall. Kira only wanted the best for her mum, and deep down, she hoped Sandra would find true happiness one day. So, when Sandra introduced Kira to Jamal, Kira's gut reaction wasn't what she expected. She had always known her mother to be cautious and careful. Sandra wasn't the type to jump into things, especially not with someone so much younger. But Jamal, with his charm and easy smile, seemed to have completely won Sandra over. The more Kira watched, the more something didn't feel right. At first, Kira tried to keep her feelings to herself. She didn't want to upset Sandra or create tension between them. After all, Sandra deserved a chance to be happy, even if this situation felt a little unusual. But no matter how hard she tried, Kira couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. Something about Jamal's sudden arrival in Sandra's life seemed too perfect, almost like it had been planned. His constant attention to Sandra, always hovering, always in the background, made Kira uneasy. It wasn't natural. It felt calculated. She couldn't deny that Jamal had a way about him. He was charming, sure, but to Kira it all seemed too practiced, too smooth. His words felt rehearsed, and his actions didn't add up. Kira even tried asking him about his past, about where he came from, but he always brushed her off, offering vague answers that only made Kira more suspicious. Something just wasn't right. Still, Kira kept her thoughts to herself. She didn't want to stir up trouble, especially when it came to her mother's happiness. So, she chose to stay quiet and watch from the sidelines, hoping her instincts were wrong, hoping she was just being paranoid. But then, everything changed. Sandra passed away suddenly, just days after the wedding. Kira was left in a state of shock. The grief hit her like a ton of bricks. She couldn't believe it. Her mother was gone, and all Kira could do was sit with the feeling that something wasn't right about the whole situation. She couldn't wrap her head around how her mom, who had seemed pretty healthy despite her heart condition, could just be gone so suddenly. It felt like it happened too fast, too final, and something about it didn't sit right with her. As she handled the details that followed, Kira couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her mom's death that people weren't talking about. There was something about Jamal's behavior at the hospital and in the days after that bothered her. The way he showed his grief felt too calculated. His sighs of sorrow seemed to come at just the right moment. To most people, he looked like a grieving husband, but Kira saw it differently. It felt like he was putting on an act, almost as if he were playing a part. Her gut told her something was off, so Kira decided to follow her instincts and dig deeper. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Investigating her mum's death could cause problems with Jamal and even hurt her mum's close friends. But Kira had learned to trust her gut, especially in her line of work. It had never steered her wrong before. Without wasting any time, she asked for a toxicology report. She was determined to find answers, no matter how hard it might be. She knew there could be pushback, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. Kira's mother had passed away, and the official cause of death was natural, but Kira couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. She knew her doubts might seem out of place to others, but she couldn't just ignore them. If she was going to live with herself, she had to find the truth, even if it meant standing alone in her suspicion. It all came down to the toxicology report. Kira had been so nervous about the results. Part of her hoped they'd reveal something that could explain her mother's sudden death, but the other part of her feared finding something far darker. When she finally opened the report, it felt like everything she had been thinking was confirmed. Her mother's death wasn't what it seemed. The report said that Sandra had died from an overdose of her heart medication, but this wasn't just any overdose. It was a much higher dose than what her doctor had prescribed. Kira was overwhelmed with emotions. Grief, anger, confusion. She knew her mum better than anyone, and there was no way Sandra would have ever made a mistake like that. Her mum was always careful, almost obsessively so, when it came to her health. Kira knew that any kind of mistake or forgetfulness was out of the question. This wasn't an accident. Kira's mind immediately went to one person, Jamal. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became. There was only one explanation now. Someone had intentionally messed with her mum's medication, and that person was Jamal. He was the one who had the access to the pills, and he was the only one who had a reason to do something like this. Kira remembered all the times Jamal had helped out with Sandra. She thought back to every meal he had cooked, every kind gesture he had made. He had always been so attentive, always playing the role of the loving husband. Kira even remembered the way he'd organized her mum's medication with a big smile, as if he were doing something kind. But now, that smile felt like a mask. Her heart broke as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. It wasn't care. It wasn't love. It had all been a setup, a way for Jamal to get what he wanted, no matter the cost. If you're finding this true crime story as eye-opening as we are, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Like this video if you believe in the power of justice, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Let's spread awareness together and help protect others from the same mistakes. Kira couldn't shake the heavy feeling in her chest as she thought about her mum. It broke her heart to realize that her mother had unknowingly ended up with a man who seemed to have no conscience at all. She decided to dig deeper, starting with her mum's banker. The banker revealed some unsettling details. Her mum had made changes to her financial accounts before she passed away, including naming her husband as the beneficiary, even for her life insurance. That moment it hit Kira hard. She could see the motive clear as day. At that point, Kira was sure Jamal had something to do with her mother's death. It made her more determined than ever to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. But she knew that just trusting her gut wouldn't be enough. She needed real proof to make sure Jamal would face the consequences of his actions. Using her position as a police officer, Kira threw herself into the investigation. She dug into Jamal's past, following every lead she could find. She wasn't going to let him get away with hiding his tracks. As she looked deeper, she uncovered layers of lies and fake identities. Jamal had worked hard to erase his past and cover up who he truly was. With each discovery, the man she once thought was her mother's loving husband started to look like a complete stranger, a man hiding a lifetime of deceit. Kira was digging into Jamal's past, trying to make sense of the strange things she had discovered, but what she found shook her to her core. In every city he had lived, Jamal had left a trail of broken lives behind him. The lives he destroyed always seemed to revolve around wealthy older women, women who reminded her so much of her own mother. As Kira pieced everything together, the story began to make sense in the worst way. Jamal wasn't just a charming man. He had changed his name several times, and he had been married before. Not once, not twice, but 4 times. Every woman he had married was older and well off, and strangely they all died suddenly not long after Jamal became the main beneficiary of their estates. The pattern was undeniable. He would get close to these women, pretending to love them, and then use their loneliness and need for companionship to get what he wanted, control over their money, and when he had everything he needed, their deaths seemed to follow. The more Kira uncovered, the more sickened she felt, but also the more determined she became. She couldn't ignore this. It wasn't just her mother he had hurt, there were other women too. And Kira wasn't about to let him get away with it. Kira started to feel like it was her responsibility to stop Jamal. She couldn't let him hurt anyone else. Her mother's death wasn't just a personal tragedy anymore. It was part of a bigger picture of cruelty and manipulation. The idea that her mother might have been just another victim in a long line of women was heartbreaking, but it gave Kira even more strength to keep going. With all the pieces falling into place, Kira was getting ready to confront Jamal and make sure he paid for everything he'd done. She wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore. She was an investigator now, driven by a deep sense of justice, ready to expose Jamal for who he really was. Meanwhile, Jamal was starting to feel the heat. For the first time in a long while, he felt like something was slipping away from him. He had built his life on lies, and now he was starting to see cracks in the walls he had so carefully constructed. He noticed more police around Sandra's house, and something about the way he was being watched made him uneasy. He wasn't used to feeling like this, like someone was on his trail. He had always been one step ahead of everyone, always able to outsmart anyone who tried to catch him. But this time, it felt different. This time, someone was closing in on him. And it wasn't just the police. Kira Harris, fueled by her grief and her need for justice, was no longer just a daughter in mourning. She was a force to be reckoned with, and Jamal could feel it. The pressure was building, and he knew it was only a matter of time before everything he had worked so hard to hide came crashing down. Kira knew that she was facing a dangerous opponent. Jamal was a skilled manipulator, a master of deception. He would stop at nothing to protect himself, to ensure his freedom. But Kira was prepared. She had drawn a line in the sand. She wouldn't let her mother's death be in vain. She wouldn't allow Jamal to continue his reign of terror, to prey on other vulnerable women. The battle lines were drawn. The game of cat and mouse had begun. Jamal had always been one to stay calm under pressure, but this time things were different. His life, which he had carefully built and controlled, was starting to unravel. He could feel it in the air, the little things that told him something wasn't right. He began to notice the extra police cars cruising down his street, the quiet conversations that stopped as soon as he walked into a room, and the way Kira's gaze seemed to follow him everywhere. The weight of being watched was getting harder to ignore. Jamal, who had always prided himself on his ability to stay one step ahead, was beginning to feel a creeping panic. For the first time, he couldn't shake the feeling that his freedom was slipping away. He'd been here before. In the past, when things got too close, he had slipped out unnoticed, starting fresh in a new city, a new life. And he thought he could do it again. Jamal started making his plans. He pulled out cash in small amounts so it wouldn't raise suspicion. He packed a small suitcase with just enough to keep him going. Every step he took was calculated, every detail thought through. He erased all traces of his online life, making sure there was nothing left for anyone to trace. The plan was simple: leave under the cover of darkness with only the essentials and some forged papers to start fresh somewhere far away. But what Jamal didn't know was that Kira had already anticipated his every move. She knew him well, his habits, his patterns. She knew he'd try to run, just like he had done before. So, she made sure he didn't get away this time. Quietly, she reached out to the right people. She used her connections, pulling strings to get him placed under surveillance. She knew the authorities had to catch him before he could disappear again, so they watched his every step, waiting for the right moment. That moment came sooner than Jamal expected. The night he decided to leave, as he made his way through the streets, trying to make a quiet escape, the sound of sirens filled the air. Law enforcement vehicles surrounded him, chasing him down through the dark streets, their flashing lights cutting through the night. Jamal did what he could to evade them, but this time it wasn't going to be so easy. Kira had thought of everything. Her plan worked, and in the end, Jamal was caught. As he was escorted away in handcuffs, Jamal's face was full of defiance. He didn't show fear. He tried to hold on to the last shred of control. His usual confidence was replaced with quiet rage, and he barely acknowledged the officers around him. Kira watched from a distance, her emotions a mix of anger, grief, and a small sense of satisfaction. She had been through so much. Her family had been hurt by this man, and now, finally, she would get the chance to make sure he faced justice. She could see the rage in his eyes as they locked gazes, but she didn't flinch. This was more than personal. She had to make sure Jamal paid for everything he had done. For Kira, this moment was heavy. There was no joy in seeing him caught, but there was something about it that felt right. It was the justice she had fought for, not just for herself, but for every person he had hurt along the way. She stood tall, her face set with determination. She wasn't going to let him slip away this time. No more false identities, no more hiding. He would stand in front of everyone and face the consequences of his actions. The trial that followed was intense. Jamal, as always, played the role of the victim. He claimed to be a grieving widower, accused of things he never did. His words were carefully chosen, each sentence aimed at making him look like the one who had been wronged. But Kira was ready. She knew the truth, and this time she wasn't going to let him get away with it. The courtroom was filled with tension, and everyone could feel it. This was the moment of reckoning. Jamal kept insisting that he truly loved Sandra, and that her death was just a tragic accident. He spoke with what seemed like genuine sorrow, his voice calm and steady, hoping to convince the jury with his carefully crafted act. But the prosecution was determined to expose the truth, breaking down his lies one by one. Kira showed up every day to the trial, her presence a constant reminder of the pain Jamal had caused. She listened closely as the prosecution shared the evidence she had worked so hard to uncover. The toxicology report, the altered will, and the forged signatures, all pointing to Jamal's plan to deceive everyone. They explained how he had gotten his hands on Sandra's medication, changing it to make it look like she was naturally getting worse. The courtroom went quiet as these facts came out, each one casting a darker shadow over Jamal's claims of being innocent. But it wasn't just Sandra's story that filled the courtroom. As the trial went on, families of other women Jamal had hurt came forward, each one telling stories that sounded too similar to Sandra's tragic end. Mothers, daughters, and sisters of his previous wives spoke about the pain they went through, the strange and suspicious ways their loved ones had passed away, and the eerie similarities between each case. Their words painted a chilling picture of Jamal's pattern of manipulation, with each story proving what Kira had uncovered. Women who, just like Sandra, had trusted Jamal's love, only to be used, discarded, and left behind as part of his cold plan to get money. Jamal tried to stay calm, but with each new witness, cracks started to appear in his calm facade. The emotional testimonies left a strong impact on the jury, showing them firsthand the damage Jamal had caused. The prosecution didn't hold back, highlighting how cold and calculating Jamal had been. They described how he could change himself into whatever persona each victim needed, only to take away their dignity, their money, and in the end their lives. One piece of evidence after another broke down Jamal's defense, showing his history of lies and how he used psychological manipulation to trap his victims. Then came the final blow. The prosecution presented proof of Jamal's multiple fake identities, showing how he had created new names and backstories to stay hidden. The courtroom fell silent as each alias was read out loud, each one a reminder of someone he had destroyed. The weight of his actions filled the room, and for the first time, Jamal's composure began to crack. The mask of innocence he had worked so hard to maintain started to slip, revealing the cold, calculating man who had spent years perfecting the art of deceit. The trial reached its peak with the final arguments that left no room for doubt about Jamal's intentions. The prosecution made its last appeal, urging the jury to consider the harm Jamal had caused and the need to prevent others from falling prey to his lies. The families of his victims watched closely, hoping for justice after all the pain they'd been through. As the jury came back with their decision, Kira felt a sense of relief wash over her, knowing that her mother's voice, along with the voices of so many others, had finally been heard. Jamal was found guilty on several charges, each one a reflection of the lives he had damaged and the trust he had broken. His attempts to run, his endless lies, and his repeated patterns of trickery had all led to this point. Kira knew that her mother's legacy would not be forgotten, nor would it be overshadowed by the lies Jamal had spread. Instead, Sandra's memory would live on as a symbol of strength and justice, a reminder that truth comes out even when it's buried under layers of deception. As Jamal was taken away, Kira allowed herself to finally grieve. She had fought hard to get to this moment, and now it was over. Sandra had gotten the justice she deserved. What had once seemed like a never-ending tragedy was now starting to feel a little less painful. Seeing Jamal face the consequences gave Kira a sense of peace. This wasn't just about punishing him. It was about honoring Sandra's memory. A mother wouldn't be remembered for the lies Jamal told. Instead, she would be remembered as a strong woman, a mother who had raised a daughter willing to stand up for what was right. Jamal's punishment wasn't just about revenge. It was about showing the world what resilience, courage, and truth looked like. In that moment, Kira felt her mother's presence with her, as though Sandra was finally at peace, knowing her story had ended with justice. Looking back on everything that had happened, Kira couldn't help but think about how Jamal's actions had affected more than just her mother. He didn't just target Sandra, he preyed on a need that many people had, a need for connection, for companionship, for love. Jamal had used these feelings to manipulate and hurt people, all for his own benefit. Kira thought about all the other women, like her mother, who had fallen for the same tricks, people who had been kind and trusting, only to have their trust betrayed by someone who saw their goodness as a weakness. This experience had opened Kira's eyes to how people like Jamal work. They slip into your life, gain your trust, and then use it against you. It made Kira realize how important it is for people to be aware of these kinds of dangers, to recognize when they're being manipulated before it's too late. Her mother's story had taught her the importance of staying alert and trusting your gut, even when your heart wants to believe the best in someone. Kira wanted others to learn from her mother's experience, to understand the value of protecting themselves in a world where people like Jamal exist. Kira hoped that Sandra's story would serve as a reminder to others to be careful with their trust, to pay attention to the warning signs of manipulation, and to always put their own worth above promises that seem too good to be true. Sandra's memory would live on, not just as a woman who had been wronged, but as a symbol of awareness. Her story would remind others to be careful with whom they trust, and to value their own self-worth over anyone's promises of love or devotion. As Sandra's story comes to an end, and Jamal's downfall is sealed, we're left with questions that extend beyond just this one case. How well do we really know the people close to us? Could we spot when someone close to us has hidden motives? Would we recognize the signs of manipulation if we were caught up in it? These are the questions that will stay with us long after the trial is over. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more real-life stories and lessons. Give us a like if this message resonates with you, and feel free to share it with someone who might need to hear it. Together, we can spread awareness and help others avoid the traps set by people like Jamal.